folk culture. On our expeditions round Europe, Sarah and I from time to time visited folk museums. The two I remember most distinctly were the Folk Museum in Portugal, a wonderful open display museum, and one just in the suburbs of Paris, the Musée des Arts et Traditions Populaires. And we were amazed by these places. They were filled with other worlds, the worlds of ordinary village people, their objects and their beliefs and everything else, beautifully laid out and entirely different from the high culture that one also found in France or Portugal. And I remember discussing this with my friend Peter Laslett, the historian, who was really angry that the British hadn't set up folk museums. He said, "Alan, let's set up a proper folk museum like the one in Paris." And I thought about it, and then my answer to him was, well, we haven't got a folk museum like that because we don't have folk. And this was reinforced by looking at what was actually called a folk museum in Cambridge, the Cambridge Folk Museum. But when you went there, it was an entirely different feeling from the French or the Portuguese or the Viennese or others. It was filled with objects used by the working classes and the lower middle class, factory produced, not made by them on the whole, and nothing to do with a rural folk mentality. And it's been renamed at the Cambridge History Museum. And so what I meant when I said to Peter, we have no folk, related to my work slightly earlier on the origins of English individualism, where, to my great surprise, I had found that if you go back through history, back and back and back, you find that there is no great distinction between town and country, between the classes, and there is no distinction of the kind which Peter Burke talks about. Peter described the difference between the great tradition and the little tradition. This is taken from anthropological work, particularly in India. The great tradition is the literate townsmen, the people who run the country, and they indulge in high arts and so on. The little tradition is the folk tradition. It's the art and culture of ordinary villagers who usually can't read or write and have their own traditions of music and housing and everything else. And I saw this even in Denmark, where they have some really good folk museums. So, having found that the British didn't have peasants in the traditional meaning, that is, country dwellers who are entirely separate from town dwellers, this led me to realize that if you don't have that split, then it's very likely that all the arts and culture that are associated with the two different traditions will be merged, and you will have no normal folk tradition of the kind that you have in Germany, even in Celtic realms in northern Scotland. You could have a folk museum of kinds and so on, and Ireland, of course. So without a peasantry, you don't have folk museums. And also, you don't have folklore. And by this, I mean the stories that are told, oral stories of the kind that I encountered when I worked in Nepal, where each generation passed on its wisdom, its moral tales and its ideas through storytelling. And that kind of storytelling, which often involves supernatural powers, magic, witches, fairies, wizards, all that kind of literature, which you find very strongly in the fairy stories of Grimm or La Fontaine, or even Hans Christian Andersen, and certainly in Scottish and Irish fairy stories. Looking at the English children's literature, there was nothing of it there. If you look at collections of supposedly English fairy stories, there's no fairies really. The nearest is Tinkerbell, maybe, in Peter Pan, but basically that whole dimension is absent. And again, it's a puzzle, because if you go to other civilizations, India, China, Japan, Nepal, you'll find that. And so a world in which magic and fairy lore are very powerful and remained powerful until the 19th century had disappeared in England. And indeed, at times, I wonder whether it ever existed. I wonder whether, since English individualism, the absence of community, the absence of peasants, I think goes back to 7th, 8th centuries, and it looks a coincidence that it's really in the areas of the Germanic invasions combined with Christianity that you had the disappearance of any vestige of that folk tradition. And of course it can't be as simple as that, because I haven't investigated, but Grimm is from Germany, and there are no doubt German fairy stories as well. But that's certainly one big element in it. And so to understand the feeling of the traditions of different parts of Europe, there is this very big divide, with England separated off even from Scotland, Wales and Ireland, and certainly from the continent and also from the rest of the world. So where have all the folk gone? It's nicely summarised in a saying attributed, by me anyway, to Thomas Hobbes, that the first cannonball of the English Civil War killed the last fairy. In fact, I think the fairy was long dead.